Why do we insist on staying where our inner self has already left? How many times have you found yourself surrounded by individuals, yet felt absolutely alone?
What if fundamentally the solution to suffering lies not in enduring, but in withdrawing? If this era persists, I will retire to live in solitude, as I only perceive affliction and torment here. The wicked dominate, the virtuous are scorned, and the corrupt sit at the pinnacles of power. I am exhausted and jaded. There are silences that cry out. And there are days when the personal essence begins to fade, not due to a lack of affection, but due to too much visibility. Society demands visibility, but provides desolation. It trains us to display happiness, but not to experience it. We gradually empty ourselves inside, until one day, we wake up with a profound question. What if I simply left? Disappearing not as someone who surrenders, but as someone who refuses to keep compromising their mental health for the sake of belonging. There is a way of leaving that is not evasion. It is mental clarity. It is what Lao Tzu did when he handed his writings to the border guard and continued towards the void, riding an ox, far from the palace conspiracies, far from the ethical depravity of the world. It is not about isolation, but about purification, about finding in silence what the noise erased. In this video, we are going to walk alongside those who said, enough. Those who renounced the noise not out of cowardice, but out of courage. Those who looked at the chaos and understood that there is nothing left to save, only themselves. The hermit is not a misanthrope. He is a survivor of a saturated world. Someone who chose to breathe even if they needed to disappear to do so. Someone who, instead of shouting, chose to listen not to others, but to himself. And perhaps, if you are still here with me, in silence, it is because something inside you has already begun to retreat, is already on the sidelines, is already seeking air. You are not alone. Perhaps this video is not about leaving. Perhaps it is about remembering that, sometimes, only silence brings us back to ourselves. There are days when being in the world hurts. Not because something terrible has happened, but because it is simply too much. Too many voices, too many demands, too many expectations, too much of yourself trying to fit in. The fatigue of existing is that silent weight that accumulates in the spaces between the everyday. It is the absurd effort to appear whole when you are already in ruins. And the cruelest part is that almost no one notices, because everyone is busy trying to hide their own cracks. There is a loneliness that grows even amidst applause. And there are moments when presence becomes a kind of prison, where every conversation sounds mechanical, every gesture seems like repetition, and the air around begins to have the bittersweet smell of surrender. Nietzsche wrote that whoever fights with monsters should see to it that he himself does not become a monster. But what happens when the monster is everyday life itself? When the enemy puts on the mask of normality and devours us with small gestures, small obligations, small social lies, that is where the impulse to leave is born, not as an escape, but as a form of survival. The hermit is not a deserter. He is an exile by lucidity. He perceives the absurdity of continuing to offer his energy to a world that feeds on it without ever giving back. Sioran, the philosopher of disenchantment, wrote, "There are days when everything seems like a disease. Words, gestures, the simple act of existing. Everything becomes a symptom of weariness. That is the moment the hermit awakens. He can no longer bear to participate in a theater where the soul is the price of admission. Have you ever felt that call? That desire to turn off your phone, leave everything behind and walk without a destination just to listen to your own silence? That is not weakness. It is the body pleading for peace. It is consciousness imploring for a rest. The hermit understands that there is an invisible line between resisting and falling ill, and when the world crosses that line, he leaves. Not out of contempt for life, but out of love for it. The love that demands distance, the love that needs air. In the stillness, he discovers something everyone forgets, that life does not need to be a spectacle to have meaning. That absence is also a form of presence. And that, sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply to disappear, because there is a moment when staying becomes a form of dying and departing becomes a secret way of being reborn. Silence has always been misinterpreted. They call it weakness, surrender, cowardice. But silence, the true kind, is a gesture of strength. It is the cry that refused to beg for ears. It is the lucidity that, upon perceiving the emptiness of words, decides to be quiet. There are people who do not disappear because they surrendered. They disappear because they understood. They understood that talking too much is being swallowed by the noise, and that the current world has transformed dialogue into a battleground for hungry egos. The hermit, on the contrary, refuses to fight for attention. He has understood the absurdity of the dispute. He abandons the stage and, with that, defeats the spectacle. In an era where sound is a currency, silence is a revolutionary act. While everyone shouts, he chooses the opposite, the void. But it is not the void of surrender. It is the fertile void, the gestational silence, the one in which the soul breathes again. The ancient desert fathers knew it. They retreated to arid places, not because they hated the world, but because they needed to purify it within themselves. One of them wrote, "I fled to the desert because the world no longer fits in me. That is the true flight, not from the outside in, but from the inside out to the essential." Silence is the return to the origin, that voice prior to all voices. It is the instant when thought sheds the noise and begins to hear what was hidden, the whisper of one's own consciousness, the murmur of being. Nietzsche said that great thoughts are born of silence, and Schopenhauer saw in it the natural state of wisdom. He who speaks little is the one who learned too much from pain. But the hermit's silence is not just introspection, it is active resistance. By being quiet, he denies the cycle of vanity. By disappearing, he interrupts the economy of attention. He does not produce, does not react, does not allow himself to be consumed. And by becoming invisible, he threatens a system that only survives on available presences. Byung-Chul called this the Exhaustion Society, where the individual self-exploits until burnout. The hermit breaks that pact. He retreats not because he hates the world, but because he rejects the invitation to servitude. He chooses silence as a shield, as a refuge where consciousness regenerates. Some say that silence drives one mad, but it is the opposite. It is noise that destroys us. Silence only reveals what the noise was trying to hide. And when the world falls silent around you, you discover something terrifying: how much you talked just to avoid feeling. The hermit understands that there are truths that are only revealed in stillness, that the ego only dissolves when there is no audience, and that there is a brutal beauty in not needing to be heard to exist. Silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of the soul. It is the space where wounds can finally breathe. And for some, those who have bled too much, disappearing is not an end. It is only the beginning of a new way of listening to the world. Not all exile is geographical. Some live isolated, even surrounded by people. Others are among crowds, but with their soul in the desert. The hermit, that strange character on the margins, does not flee the world. He transcends it, and in doing so, he finds something few would endure: the abyss. The renunciation of the world is not a comfortable escape, but a dangerous immersion. When someone withdraws from the collective, they do not take the comfort of distractions with them. There are no applauses. There are no external voices that reinforce identity. Only the encounter with what was always there remains, the essential emptiness of oneself. Carl Jung called this the dark night of the soul. It is the moment when the psyche sheds its masks, and it is in that terrifying silence that ghosts, ancient fears, stifled desires, and poorly buried traumas emerge. The hermit not only confronts them, he invites them for tea. He who looks outward dreams. He who looks inward awakens. Jung reminds us that looking inward is awakening. But awakening hurts. It hurts because it demands dying to what sustained us, roles, names, social functions. That is why the hermit flirts with madness. He breaks with all references, and when everything collapses, what remains? The truth. Not the truth of books or comfortable beliefs, but the one that bleeds. The truth that says, you were never what others said you were. Dostoevsky, in Notes from Underground, describes a man who refuses to be part of the game. An isolated, embittered, almost invisible subject. But there, in that underground, he sees what no one else sees. He perceives the lie of civility, the hypocrisy of progress, the theater of human relations. And by renouncing coexistence, he opens his eyes. Being a hermit is, at times, seeing too much. But that lucidity comes at a price. One does not live on the edge of the abyss with impunity. There are days when silence screams, days when isolation suffocates, and the hermit himself asks, was I wise or just sick? It is this ambivalence that makes his journey so human. He is not a hero, not a martyr, nor a prophet. He is someone who saw too much, felt too much, and who chose solitude, not out of contempt for the world, but out of respect for himself. There is a raw purity in this gesture. By renouncing the world, the hermit exposes himself to the risk of disappearing even from himself. But paradoxically, it is in that self-erasure that something true begins to shine, something that does not depend on applause, likes, or belonging. It is a raw, silent, and almost unbearable freedom for those who never tolerated being alone. From a distance, the hermit seems free. No boss, no clock, no social obligations, no daily theater of smiling without wanting to. But is it really freedom? Or just a well-disguised escape? The line between liberation and hiding is thin, almost imperceptible, and the hermit himself knows it. He lives on that razor's edge. One day, he feels master of himself. The next, a prisoner of a silence that begins to weigh like lead. And perhaps that is precisely where the beauty of his choice lies. It is not perfect, but it is authentic. It is not an answer, but an attempt. Society offers us many forms of belonging, almost all conditioned. You belong as long as you accept the rules, as long as you smile enough, as long as you consume, opine, produce, and believe the correct narratives. The hermit cannot pretend that this is freedom. For him, accepting those conditions would be an intimate betrayal. So, he leaves. But leaving is not the same as being free. The question that resonates in the silence is always the same. Am I moving away to find myself, or just to keep from going crazy? Thoreau went to the woods to write about the essence of simple living. But, even there, he went to town from time to time. Schopenhauer isolated himself from bourgeois salons but continued to write for readers. Even the most radical of hermits carries vestiges of the world he rejects. And that is not hypocrisy, it is humanity. Because no distancing is absolute. What the hermit seeks is not necessarily to cut all ties, but to regain the autonomy to choose which ones are worthwhile. He wants to exist outside the script, without the obligation to stage a life. And that, deep down, is freedom, even if it is wrapped in pain, doubt, and solitude. The philosopher, Viktor Frankl, a concentration camp survivor, wrote that freedom is not the absence of limits, but the ability to respond meaningfully to circumstances. Perhaps the hermit is the one who found meaning in the limit, who chose the margin not out of a lack of options, but out of saturation with false options. Even so, the temptation to flee is real, fleeing from wounds, from resentments of one's own history. But the true hermit knows that wherever he goes, he takes himself with him. And if the exile is only geographical, it will only be superficial silence. That is why the distancing must be internal before it is external. Freedom is the act of choosing one's own absence as a form of presence. Fleeing is the fear of facing what the world awakens and what silence reveals. The true hermit does not flee the world. He purifies it, and what remains, after everything dissolves, can finally be called living. We have never been so connected and so exhausted. We live in a global shop window where everything must be shared, commented on, validated, but there are those who, instead of shouting louder, choose to disappear. Not out of weakness, but out of an ancient intuition. In certain times, survival demands disappearance. The modern hermit does not necessarily live in a cabin on the mountaintop. He can live on the 12th floor of any building. He pays bills, answers emails, maybe even attends meetings. But inside, he left a long time ago. He learned the art of invisibility. He does not expose himself more than necessary, avoids the noise of social media, distrusts all excess, and finds, in the silence of his discreet routine, a space of resistance. In a world that demands constant performance, the hermit is an act of sabotage. He refuses to be a commodity, rejects the motivational speeches that say everything is possible if you try hard enough. He doesn't want to win, he wants to breathe. Japanese culture has a name for this: hikikomori. Young people who shut themselves in their rooms for months, years, sometimes decades. They cannot bear the pressure, the competitiveness, the emptiness of obligatory interactions. Society calls them sick, but perhaps they are just the first to collapse, the ones who couldn't keep pretending. There is also the urban hermit, the one who survives within the system without letting himself be swallowed by it. He walks like a ghost among the shop windows, invisible to the eyes of those who rush. But he sees. He sees the absurdity. He sees the price of constant exposure. And that is why he chooses anonymity, like someone choosing a refuge from the storm. That invisibility is not absence. It is selective presence. It is the right to exist without having to justify one's own existence. Christopher Knight lived alone for 27 years in the forests of Maine. He did not speak to a single human being during that time. When he was discovered, they said he was antisocial, a disturbed person. But when asked what he had found in that silence, he replied, "A peace so profound that it became more real than any life I had before." That is the legacy of the modern hermits. To remind us that there is still another time, another way of being, an existence without applause, without filters, without the need to prove anything. To be invisible is not to surrender. It is to create space to be without being consumed. It is to build a refuge where the soul can, at last, take off its shoes. Because, in the end, perhaps that is what we are all looking for. A place where we can stop performing and simply breathe. Perhaps the hermit's greatest secret is not isolation, but the gaze he gains when he returns. Because no one remains the same after crossing the desert, neither the physical nor the one of the soul. When everything that sustained you falls, when the noise ceases, and only the sound of your own breath remains, that is where the truth is revealed, and it does not come as an answer, it comes as a mirror. The hermit understands something the world forgot, that silence is not absence, but revelation. That leaving is not surrendering, but refusing to continue sleeping in public. And that sometimes the most honest way to love the world is to no longer be a part of it. We live trying to be seen, remembered, recognized, but there is an obscene freedom in being nobody, in not needing to prove anything, in existing without having to be translated. To be invisible when conscious is a radical way of being alive. Because it is when the gaze of others turns off that we finally see what we are. The hermit's philosophy is not an escape manual. It is a reminder that all presence demands absence, that to listen to life, you must first quiet the world, and that solitude, when bravely inhabited, transforms into something sacred. A space where the self is rebuilt, particle by particle, without applause, without noise, without expectations, and perhaps that is what we are looking for, even without knowing it. An interval between haste and meaning, a space where the mind stops shouting, where the heart beats at its own rhythm and not to the beat of the crowd. So, if today you feel like disappearing, don't blame yourself. Maybe it's not fleeing, maybe it's a call. The same one that led Lao Tzu to leave riding a buffalo, Sioran to write about disenchantment, or Thoreau to build a cabin just to prove that living can be simple. The hermit lives inside each of us, that part that longs for a little silence, a less noisy life, a love that doesn't need witnesses, and when the world pushes you further away, don't fight so hard to return. Perhaps the distancing is your secret way of coming back. Perhaps leaving, in the end, is just the most sincere way to remain. I must confess something to you. This script was not just philosophical research. It came from a personal place. A few years ago, I also needed to disappear. I went months without social media, without contacts. I deleted messages unread. I skipped birthdays. People thought I was missing. But the truth is, for the first time, I was present. At first it was terrifying, then it was like coming home. I understood that the world will keep turning, with or without our anxiety to follow everything, and that sometimes the best way to find oneself is, paradoxically, to lose oneself. If you have made it this far in silence, I want to thank you, because I know it was not a coincidence. Oh, and if you perceive that it's time to make a profound change and take charge of your own psyche, join the channel. You can also simply stop watching this video and go several days without hearing anyone else. And understand, I won't condemn you sometimes. That's the only way to preserve yourself. But if you choose to stay, write a comment below. I'm still here, but not for long. Just so I understand that you get it. And if the silence still resonates within you, there are 2 videos visible on the screen now. But be cautious. One of them might reveal something to you that you might find impossible to forget. And the other, well, only watch it if you have the audacity to delve deeper.